Mr. Speaker, one of the things I wanted to do this evening is actually start to build on a theme that I've done in the past and I hope to be able to do over the coming months. But it's a little difficult right now because, let's be honest, the House is spending money at a pace where it's really hard for the Joint Economic Committee, even my own staff, to try to keep up. So we're going to talk about what's going on. But a couple things I really want us to sort of start to put on the record, talk about, and get our heads around. I have an absolute fixation of a moral obligation to the working poor in this country, and an understanding of what happened in 2018 and 2019 when the working poor, the value of their labor, and understand, for many of us, have graduate degrees and those things, can work behind a computer, great. Our skill set is what we're selling. For much of the working poor, if you didn't finish high school or you have moderate skill sets, your labor is your value. And what's going on here right now is almost a type of economic violence to that labor value. Yet I'm not sure my brothers and sisters on the other side even see it. So let's first delve into a little bit of what's going on at the border. Do understand one of the things we see in the math from 2018, 2019, when the working poor got dramatically less poor. The first 2 years in modern times where income inequality shrank. Not because rich people got less rich. It's because poorer people made money. The value of their labor increased because they weren't competing with armies of other unskilled labor. If we're going to be honest around here and say we care about the poor, we care about the working poor, don't you see the economic violence we're allowing to happen at the border, making our folks have to compete with floods of moderate to low skill immigrants? I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we need to see it in the totality of the people we claim we care about. And then the other day, I made the mistake of, on one of the hard left-leaning cable television shows, they were trying to compare what we did in tax reform to the Democrats' $1.9 trillion spending bill. And said, well, they're both about $1.9 trillion, but look here, this went to tax cuts, where this goes to spending. Isn't the spending so much more wonderful? Once again, I need my brothers and sisters on the left to go back to school and spend a moment paying attention in their economics class. The elegance of the tax reform was it made the value of workers' labor more valuable because the economy grew. We specifically made it so businesses would take part of that tax reform and put it into things that made their businesses more productive, making it so you can pay people more. Remember, individuals' wages go up on two things: inflation and productivity. It's one of the reasons in 2018 and 2019 we had the fastest wage growth of workers, and particularly the working poor, in modern history. So what's the Democrats' solution to help these populations? We're going to send them a check, and maybe part of that's good. There are people out there who are really suffering and hurting. But what do we do next year? The elegance of when you have someone's labor become more valuable is that value sets, and then the next year it builds on it, and the next year it builds on it, and the next year it builds on it, and after a little while they're no longer in the working poor. We're going to do a patch that's going to load another $1.9 trillion of debt. And over the decade, the amount of interest we're going to pay on that, it's not a 1.9 trillion, it's probably 1.6 trillion. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about just really quickly here. I cannot produce these boards fast enough to keep up with the Democrats' spending agenda right now. CBO can't produce the data fast enough. Joint Economic Committee can't produce the data fast enough to even get our heads around. So this slide here is from September. Understand, the numbers are much uglier today. And it was a simple point. In functionally 8 budget years, in September, we were saying each family would have $230,000 of federal debt applied to their household. The amount of debt, and so that's every household. That's not tax-paying households, that's every household. Today, my back-of-the-napkin math is about $250,000 in 8 years for every family in America. We are spending that fast. And being the father of a 5-year-old, the economic violence I see being done by the left here to her future, to the kids' futures. I'm looking for the day I have to sit her down and apologize that she's not going to live as well as I've lived because what we allowed to happen here today. So let's have a quick education. Let's walk through real quick where the money goes. Social Security. About $1 trillion. And remember, this is based on last year's numbers. Today's, these numbers have ballooned again. Defense, 724. Medicare, right now, I believe this year, has now surpassed defense. So my last bit of math was Medicare was now starting to pass defense in total spending. Health, that's Obamacare, that's all the other entitlements. But if you actually look at this slide, Social Security, Medicare, the other health entitlements, income security, interest, veterans, it's the vast majority of spending. Yet you look at these tiny little slices, like this little slice over here is foreign aid. Yet how often do the politicians get behind these microphones and say, well, if we would cut foreign aid, if this were a clock, I think foreign aid would cover about 14 minutes of spending in an entire day, in a 24-hour day. If we don't get our heads around the fact that the Medicare, the health entitlements, the net interest are the things now which will drive our debt, I'm terrified of what's coming. Because do understand, it's really hard to say, but our demographics, we are getting older very quickly as a society. And if you look at the 30-year curve, we are a country that doesn't make it. We are so buried in debt. And what the economic violence the Democrats are committing tomorrow by adding another 1.9 trillion on top of the trillion that's already still sitting in the bank and hasn't even been expended that we've done this last year, are we thinking about anything other than our next re-election? How about thinking about my 5-year-old daughter and what her economic future is? How about everyone else's economic future? So I'm going to try to do a couple of these quickly. We were trying to use CBO's numbers. The problem is they haven't updated them yet on how fast we're spending. But what's so important here, in functionally 8 budget years. Now this slide looks a little different than your typical debt slide because we calculate it on debt that's sold to the public, not internal debt. Remember, when you look at U.S. sovereign debt, there's sort of 2 pies. There's stuff where we reach into the Social Security fund, grab that money and borrow itself and put IOUs in it. The other debt that is economically dangerous because when interest rates move, it causes a problem. And we're going to talk about that in just real quickly. This is debt sold to the public. That might be China, it might be Japan, it might be your grandma's pension. In about 8 years, debt held by the public will double from where we were last year. Understand how fast. Now, a lot of this, believe it or not, even though some of the crazy spending we're doing right now, is our demographics. Demographics aren't Republican or Democrat. It's just math that we don't like to talk about. But the fact of the matter is we've made promises, and the money that we collected for those promises, we've already spent. And we're going to have to borrow. So understand the fragility. I love that word. fragility we've given ourselves. Interest rates in January were under 1%. They were actually at 0.91. Today, the market closed, I think it was 1.54, something of that nature. Most of us go, big deal. This is still historically really, really, really cheap. Except think about it. Just that little movement in the last 2 months, that's about $600 billion over the next 10 years. Just that little movement. $600 billion of interest. What are we buying with that interest? Nothing. And there's a lot of economists out there that think because we're spending at such a fast rate, we are going to start to chase our tail. Part of that may be because the economy actually is getting healthier. One of the great intense ironies is we're about to spend $1.9 trillion, pretend it's a stimulus, even though a bunch of that money doesn't get spent for a year, 2 years, a little bit 3 years from now. Claim it's a stimulus, pile it on as debt that's going to cost $2.6 trillion with financing costs added to it, but only a sliver of it's actually economic stimulus. And because we're going to the markets to finance every dime of it, we're helping drive up our own interest rates, meaning we're going to chase our tail economically. Do understand, remember the pie chart from before? That interest right now, we expect, and within about a decade, interest may be the second most expensive thing in our budget. You will be seeing Social Security, Medicare, and then interest right up there, and that's going to consume everything. There functionally will be no more money left. And I know I'm getting a little thick, but to try to drive this home, the changes in debt that happened from where CBO was projecting back in January to some of the numbers we're seeing right now. So just for the fun of it, I know this is hard to read. We just did a calculation and said, hey, CBO basically said, hey, interest rates are going to go up 0.25%. Think of it as 25 basis points. But if we went up 100 basis points in interest, over the 10 years of financing of that, we're basically looking at, what is that? Another $3.5 trillion of financing cost. So yes, you get to say we're spending at 1.9 trillion today, but do you understand the total cost of that? So it's not just the cost of the legislation. It's the cascade effect you're creating to the economy where that family wants to buy their first home. You just raised their mortgage interest rates. But on a national basis, this year we will finance probably about $10 trillion. My quick estimate is about $7 trillion are just our bonds that are rolling off that we have to refinance because we have no cash to pay for them. So they get reset at the new interest rates. Then we have our typical spending, so there goes another $1 trillion plus the $1 trillion we authorized back in December and last year, and now another couple $1 trillion, so maybe another 4 on top of that 7. And you start to look at over $10 trillion of new issue or refinancing coming to market of U.S. sovereign debt. What did we just do to our interest rates, the world interest rates, the value of money? And this comes back to my early point. We talk about what is happening in income inequality, the working poor. Those of us who have stocks or have a house or have assets, when you do this type of monetization of debt, when it requires the Federal Reserve to keep pumping in, today we have 20% more cash floating around in our economy than we had a year ago. People who are wealthy own things. They make a lot of money because their assets get more and more valuable. The working poor who don't own a house, they don't own stocks, they don't have a bond, they don't have a pension. What they have, they get crushed. That's what we're doing to the working poor here. Please, someone buy an economics book for my Democrat brothers and sisters to understand There's going to be a lot of singing and happy in a couple months when they get the check. And next year when they realize they're being crushed, who will step up and actually take blame, saying, we could have done things that would have grown the economy, grown your future income, made so the working poor actually had a future. Instead, we're going to flood the market with competing labor. We're going to devalue anything you could ever buy, or any asset you have, and we're going to make it so you can never afford to get out of the quartile where you're trapped. And this is what leftist policies do to poor people. So, look, this is a theme. We're going to build on it, and we're going to bring in more and more data and facts and see if we can turn around some of the heads here to say it's not enough to talk that we care. It's when you actually can stand up and say, Republican policies in 2018, 2019, before the virus, we actually made a difference. We're the party that actually closed income inequality. We're the party that actually made the working poor less poor. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.